The title of today's podcast is Selfishness versus Self-fullness. And self-fullness is spelled with a capital S. The divine quality I'm going to ask you to focus on during this podcast is divine self-fullness, which will be explained in the podcast. Today we'll be focusing on Chapter 7, The Gifts of the Kingdom, Section 9, The Extension of the Kingdom, paragraphs 1 through 5. We'll start with paragraph 1. In heaven, your creative power within the Sonship is your extension of God's love that brings forth what? That brings forth your own new creations. Ever since your misguided choice to participate in the separation, you have greatly limited what? You have limited your creative power. You still have God's love flowing through you, but it remains God's will for you to do what with God's love? Although God's love always flows to you, it is God's will for you to let His love flow through you, even in this world of illusions. Quote, only you can limit your creative power, but God wills to increase it. Your creations in heaven wait for what? Your creations wait for your acceptance of God's will for you of awakening to your true home in God's kingdom. God, quote, no more wills you to deprive yourself of your creations than He wills to deprive Himself of His. What are the only two things that are real in this world of illusions? Every sleeping son of God and every expression of love are real in this dream world. What is God's way of creating and also your way of creating? The answer is sharing love. Quote, every loving thought held in any part of the Sonship belongs to every part. It is shared because it is loving. Sharing is God's way of creating and also yours. What are your gifts to the Sonship? Your extensions of love to your brothers are your gifts to the Sonship. These gifts are miracles because they are expressions of love. Quote, do not withhold your gifts to the Sonship, or you withhold yourself from God. When you express the ego, you are doing what in relation to your brother? When you express the ego, you are separating yourself from your brothers, and this is selfishness. Quote, selfishness is of the ego. What is the totality and power of all parts of the Sonship joined in oneness, wholeness, and full abundance of Christ within the mind of God? This totality of all parts of the Sonship in its oneness is what self-fullness is. Quote, but self-fullness is of the Spirit because that is how God created it. As your teacher and guide, the Holy Spirit mediates between what? The Holy Spirit mediates between the ego and spirit. The Holy Spirit, quote, lies between the ego and spirit, mediating between them, always in favor of the Spirit. The Holy Spirit reminds you to not invest in what? The Holy Spirit reminds you to not invest in the ego-based part of your split perceptual mind. The Holy Spirit encourages you to invest fully in what? The Holy Spirit encourages you to invest in the right mind part of your split mind, which is a reflection of your spirit and a reflection of the total awareness of knowledge. What enables the Holy Spirit to mediate between the ego and spirit? What enables the Holy Spirit to mediate between the ego and spirit is the fact that the Holy Spirit possesses both limited perception and unlimited knowledge. The Holy Spirit's function is judgment, and the ego perceives that the Holy Spirit's judgments are what? The ego perceives that the Holy Spirit's judgments are unfairly biased against the ego. Quote, to the ego, this is partiality, and it responds as if it were being sided against. Because the ego perceives itself to be alone and apart from everyone and everything, the ego stands for what? The ego stands for separation and for what is false. The Holy Spirit judges against what and for what? The Holy Spirit judges against the ego and judges always in favor of the Spirit. Why does the Holy Spirit judge against the ego and judge always in favor of the Spirit? Because the Holy Spirit acknowledges only oneness and truth of the Spirit, and therefore the Holy Spirit judges against the separateness and falseness of the ego. Spirit knows its fullness as being what? Spirit knows its self-fullness as being all-inclusive and therefore stands for the oneness of God and the oneness of the Sonship. Knowing its self-fullness as being one with God and one with the entire Sonship, Spirit cannot conceive of what? Spirit cannot conceive of ideas of exclusion and separation, which the ego mistakenly believes. Because Spirit is all-inclusive, Spirit, quote, cannot conceive of any part from which it is excluded. Paragraph 2. If you identify with the ego, you will believe you are what in relation to God and the Sonship. If you identify with the ego, you will believe you are a separate self, disconnected from all other parts of the Sonship, disconnected from your shared self, and disconnected from God. The ego can only temporarily block your awareness of what? The ego can temporarily block your awareness of the fact that you are part of God and the fact that you are one with the wholeness of the Sonship. Quote, if you are part of God and the Sonship is one, you cannot be limited to the self the ego sees. The ego's idea of individuality rests entirely on what belief? The ego's idea of individuality rests on the belief that you have a separate identity that stands apart from all other individuals and so is alone. Quote, the ego is the part of the mind that believes your existence is defined by separation. The ego's version of your identity as a separate individual is a distortion of what? The ego's version of your identity is a distortion of your true divine identity, which is not based on separation, but is based on relationships and oneness. Your divine individuality and the shared aspect of your being are two aspects of what? Your divine individuality and the shared aspect of your being are two aspects of your one identity. One of the two aspects of your identity is your true divine individuality. But what exactly is this individual aspect? This individual aspect is the fact that you are one unique part of the Sonship in a relationship of oneness with all the other unique parts of the Sonship. The other aspect of your one identity is the shared aspect of your being. But what is this shared aspect? This shared aspect is the Christ, the Son of God, the one self, shared by all the individual parts of the Sonship. This one shared self means that all the unique parts of the Sonship are joined in what? All the unique parts of the Sonship are joined in the oneness of the one mind of Christ within the mind of God. Quote, you dwell in the mind of God with your brother, for God himself did not will to be alone. How close is your relationship with your brothers? Your relationship with your brothers is so close that your brothers are part of you and you are part of each one of them. Your brothers and you being part of each other is the nature of what? Your brothers and you being part of each other is the nature of having a shared self in which there are no separate parts. Within the shared self, what is the relationship between the parts of the sonship and the wholeness of the self? Every part is the whole. In other words, every part of the sonship is the wholeness of the self. Quote, the idea of part-whole relationships has meaning only at the level of perception where change is possible. Otherwise, there is no difference between the part and the whole. What it's saying here is that within perception, for example, a part of a clock cannot be the whole clock. But in heaven, where everyone possesses knowledge, every part is the whole. Why is it possible that every part of the sonship is the wholeness of the self? Within the mind of God, every individual part of the sonship is the wholeness of the self, because God gave all of himself to every part. Quote, the recognition of the part as whole and of the whole in every part is perfectly natural, for it is the way God thinks, and what is natural to him is natural to you. The sonship in its oneness includes you and all the other parts of the sonship, and all parts of the sonship are joined in what? All parts of the sonship are joined in the wholeness of God and joined in the one Christ, the one self, the one Son of God. Quote, God has many sons, but only one. God gave you all there is, and thus is every living thing a part of you as of himself, meaning as of God himself. Your full awareness of your true spiritual nature includes your awareness of what? Includes your awareness of all your brothers who are part of you, just as you are part of them within the mind of God. Quote, Spirit knows that the awareness of all its brothers is included in its own, as it is included in God. The term self-fullness refers to the power of what? Self-fullness refers to the power of your spiritual nature that comes from the oneness and wholeness of the entire sonship and of God. Quote, the power of the whole sonship and its creator is therefore the Spirit's own fullness, rendering its creations equally whole and equal in perfection. The ego is isolated and weak and will ultimately fail in its feeble attempts to survive as the belief in your mind. Because of what reason? Because the ego is up against God and the wholeness of the sonship. Quote, the ego cannot prevail against a totality that includes God, and any totality must include God. Because God gave all himself to every son of God, every part of the sonship remains part of him and has what? Every part of the sonship is part of God and has all of God's power. Everything God, quote, created is given all his power because it is part of him and shares his being with him. The ego's efforts, which are directed away from giving and toward taking, result in what? The ego's efforts result in loss and sacrifice. Your function of creating through sharing love brings what? Your function of creating through sharing love brings gain and blessings that are the result of giving. Quote, creating is the opposite of loss, as blessing is the opposite of sacrifice. If you do not create by extending your being, you cannot know what? You cannot know your true nature of love. Quote, being must be extended. That is how it retains the knowledge of itself. Spirit yearns to share what? The full quote is, Spirit yearns to share its being as its Creator did. Created by sharing, its will is to create. It is natural for you to share your being just as God shared his being to create you, making you part of himself forever. God is changeless in what way? God is changeless not in the sense of being static, but rather God is changeless because he is constantly increasing as his creations bring forth new creations that extend his being. Spirit, quote, does not wish to contain God, but wills to extend his being. Because God, including his creation, is changelessly increasing, if God stopped increasing, that would be what? That would be a change. Nevertheless, he will never stop increasing, so he will never change. God's creation, quote, is eternally changeless. It does not change by increase because it was forever created to increase. Paragraph 3. The only function of spirit is to do what? The only function of spirit is to extend God's being by creating new creations that add to his kingdom. Quote, the extension of God's being is spirit's only function. The self-fullness of spirit means that it cannot be what? The self-fullness of spirit means that it cannot be limited and must extend its fullness. Spirit's, quote, fullness cannot be contained any more than can the fullness of its creator. Fullness is extension. If you invest in the ego, you cannot perform your what? If you invest in the ego, you cannot perform your God-given function of extension of fullness. Quote, the ego's thought system blocks extension and thus blocks your function. Because the ego blocks your function, it prevents what? Your ego prevents your joy and makes you feel incomplete and unfulfilled. The ego, quote, blocks your joy so that you perceive yourself as unfulfilled. When you create, you will feel fulfilled because you are doing what? Because you are performing your function and sharing love and sharing joy. Quote, unless you create, you are unfulfilled. Is it possible for you to completely stop creating because part of your mind is dreaming of separation from heaven? No, it is not possible for you to stop creating even though part of your mind is dreaming of separation from heaven. God's will for you is to create. So, you are still creating in heaven now without knowing it. Quote, God does not know unfulfillment, and therefore you must create. What aspect of your one identity may feel unfulfilled? Only the individual aspect of your one identity has fallen asleep, and it may choose to not create and feel unfulfilled. What aspect of your one identity is always creating and feeling fulfilled? The shared aspect of your one identity, which is yourself, continues to create new creations in heaven, while the dreaming part of your mind is unaware of your creating new creations. Quote, you may not know your own creations, but this can no more interfere with their reality than your unawareness of your spirit can interfere with its being. Paragraph 4. Because God is forever increasing, His kingdom is forever increasing. Because His kingdom is doing what? Quote, the kingdom is forever extending because it is in the mind of God. This is the extending of love in which new creations are being added to God's kingdom. While your one shared self is creating and increasing God's kingdom now, your dreaming mind is currently not aware of what? Your dreaming mind is not aware of your joy, and your dreaming mind is unaware of the self that is the aspect of your identity in heaven that has not fallen asleep. Quote, you do not know your joy because you do not know your own self-fullness. Your self-fullness includes all parts of what? Your self-fullness includes all parts of the sonship that are joined with you in your one true shared self. If you reject any brother that you meet in this world of illusions, you are doing what? You are excluding part of God's kingdom and are rejecting the awareness of your wholeness as the Holy Son of God. Quote, exclude any part of the kingdom from yourself and you are not whole. After the separation, when you lost knowledge, your perceptual mind became split into your right mind and your ego-based mind, so you lost the awareness of what? You lost the awareness of the wholeness of your mind, and you could not be aware of your self-fullness. Quote, a split mind cannot perceive its fullness and needs the miracle of the mind's wholeness to dawn upon it and heal it. After the body passes away, you will be in a crisis of decision in which you will have to choose between what two alternatives? You will have to choose between the choice of reincarnation or the choice to wake up in heaven where you will accept your wholeness and your self-fullness. If you choose to wake up in heaven, you will accept the miracle of the mind's wholeness by doing what? You will accept the miracle of the mind's wholeness by embracing the blazing light of the face of Christ, which includes simultaneously fully accepting the perfect love of the atonement. Your reawakening in heaven, quote, reawakens the wholeness in the mind and restores it to the kingdom because of its acceptance of wholeness. The mind's wholeness, which is its self-fullness, includes love for everyone that cannot conceive of what? The mind's wholeness, which is its self-fullness, cannot conceive of selfishness and wants only to create by extending love. Quote, the full appreciation of the mind's self-fullness makes selfishness impossible and extension inevitable. Your self-fullness is shared equally by all parts of the sonship, and when you fully accept your self-fullness, you also accept what? You also accept the perfect peace of God in which there is never any thought of conflict. The acceptance of your self-fullness, quote, is why there is perfect peace in the kingdom. God's perfect peace is the result of accepting your self-fullness and accepting and performing your what? Accepting and performing your only function in heaven by creating through extending God's love. Quote, Spirit is fulfilling its function, and only complete fulfillment is peace. Paragraph 5. Although you are normally unaware of your creations in heaven, your creations are protected for you because of what? Your creations are protected for you, quote, because the Holy Spirit, who is in your mind, knows of them and can bring them into your awareness whenever you will let him. Similar to the way you were created by God, your creations remain forever what? Your own creations remain as part of you, and certainly as part of your self-fullness. Your creations are within the wholeness of your mind, quote, as part of your own being, because your fulfillment includes them. Are your creations exclusively yours in heaven? No. There is nothing exclusive about your creations because every new creation belongs equally to you and to every other part of the Sonship. Quote, the creations of every Son of God are yours, since every creation belongs to everyone being created for the Sonship as a whole. Are the animals and plants in this world of illusions form-related versions of creations of the Sonship? The answer is that some speculate that animals and plants are new creations added to the kingdom by the Sonship before the separation, but the Course does not address this possibility one way or the other. That was the end of the questions and answers portion of this podcast. Now I ask you to join me in a 1-minute meditation. I ask you in the beginning to focus on self-fullness, the fullness of your true self. Self-fullness is the wholeness of your mind, the oneness of your mind. That includes everyone, everything. It includes God, includes all parts of the Sonship. This self-fullness cannot conceive of anyone or anything being excluded. It includes all of reality. And this is your self-fullness that everyone in the Sonship shares equally. So I ask you during this 1-minute meditation to focus on this self-fullness that we each possess, even while we're dreaming of separation, even though we're dreaming of being incomplete. The fact is that our spirit possesses this self-fullness, this completion. I'm going to set the timer for 1 minute. When the timer goes off, that will be the end of the meditation and the end of the podcast. Focusing on the self-fullness, the wholeness and fullness of our minds, Here we go together. Amen.